Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for downloading the Fanatical Curiosity webinar brought to you by Select Advisors Institute. This is Amy Parvane, founder and CEO of Select Advisor Institute. And we're very excited today to bring to you Scott West, who is the head of consulting at Invesco. He is also the author of 5 books, including one of my all-time favorites called Storyselling for Financial Advisors, How Top Producers Sell. Today, Scott will discuss how fanatical curiosity in your everyday conversations with clients can deepen those relationships, as well as increase the wallet share, referral accusation, acquiring, as well as any other ways you want to deepen those client and prospect relationships. So, with that, I will hand over the control to Scott and come in later on for a few questions. So, with that, Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone listening to us. Those of you that heard the previous teaser on our program, what we're going to talk about today really is 3 key things. Taking into effect the core assumption that we all really, at the core of what we do, we get paid to communicate. And what we say that, we're actually saying that we get paid to have persuasive conversations. And really what that means is transferring confidence. And that's really, when you look at it, what successful selling is all about. It's transferring the convictions you have to the people you're talking to. And as I mentioned before, we're going to talk today specifically about curiosity and what is so powerful about some of the best advisors in our industry that are great conversationalists. And you know when you encounter a great conversationalist, and even outside of our business, ask yourself the question, when was the last time you had a conversation with someone and you just sensed that they had a deep, insatiable appetite to learn more about you? And it wasn't weird. They weren't stalking you. They genuinely were interested in knowing about you. That doesn't happen very often. We don't necessarily have a lot of those conversations. And unfortunately, as we look in our industry as well, we also don't find a lot of premium placed on conversation. And so what I'd like to do today is really talk to you about some of the principles. And in this talk, we'll hopefully deliver 3 key things. One, show you just the power of what great questions can lead to, that they can actually create commonality. And why commonality is so important is because great commonality leads to confidence. Secondly, the research is also going to show exactly what are the 8 core topics that your clients want you to know about them. That's a bold statement, but it's based on research we've done over the years, a very large piece of research that we updated recently with Russ Prince. Russ is a researcher in Shelton, Connecticut, and he's been a partner with us on many research projects. And this was one of the most exciting ones we ever did with him, where he interviewed over 400 investors. And the idea was to find out, what are the topics, what are the areas that you could be curious about with a client that would actually, as Amy said, lead to a greater wallet share, that you would be the dominant relationship. And out of those 150 topics that you could be curious about that span the globe of potential topics like favorite vacation spots and names of the spouse or kids, there were eight that actually drove assets. And so what we want to show you is what those 8 core topics are that can create a deep and lasting relationship. And then lastly, rather than just machine gun those 8 topics the next time you're standing in front of a client, we ask ourselves this question: is there a process by which we get to know people? When we start meeting somebody for the very first time, and whether it's a client or just somebody in our personal lives, and we deepen a relationship with them, is there a repeatable, predictable process that we go through? Nothing mechanical or scientific, but is there a process where we, over time in our relationship, do we all touch the same common areas? And I want to suggest to you that, like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, that there are 4 corner pieces that you need to put in place to build that puzzle that is your client's story. And so we'll give you what we believe is the natural order of curiosity. But I begin by just asking you rhetorically, do you agree with me that we've sort of lost this sense of curiosity? And I'm not suggesting it's completely gone. We do meet people. I travel a lot, and I've had some very engaging conversations with people and on airplanes or waiting for planes. And so there are some great conversational stuff. But whether you blame technology or just increased privacy, whatever you lay blame to it, we just are not a society that is as deeply curious as we once were. And this picture that you see up here of this particular home is an example of that. I mean, here's a picture of a home that we would say is a beautiful, beautiful home that 30 years ago, someone would look at that and say, there's a huge feature missing, very conspicuously absent from that home. And you look at that and say, well, it doesn't have a satellite dish and it doesn't appear to be a sidewalk. But what's missing is a feature that even the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about a couple of years ago, because they've sensed a resurgence in Middle America of this particular feature that's missing from this picture. What's missing is the front porch. It's interesting, as you probably know, when you're driving around neighborhoods, people tend to spend a lot of money on the backs of their houses, building decks and pools and all kinds of things in the back of their house, but very few people actually spend money on their front porch. I had a colleague of mine who, when I was in town, I drove by his house on my commute to work, and I noticed that Bob was doing some kind of a renovation on his house. And as I continued to drive past his home on a few more occasions, eventually I stopped. Bob was there at the time, and I said, Bob, boy, this is interesting. What are you doing? Is this a great room? Are you refinishing the house? What are you extending the living room? And he said, no. He said his wife and he both decided that they love their neighborhood, and they both shared the same experience growing up as having a porch, a front porch. It represented sort of this mythical gathering spot where in an almost idyllic setting where mothers would sit and sip lemonade and talk to other mothers in the neighborhood, and kids would gather, and it became a meeting spot. And I said, Bob, that's incredible. I mean, that's an amazing investment. And I remember driving away from his home that morning thinking, what a colossal waste of money. And that was before I got really interested in this whole topic of curiosity, and began to realize that curiosity is a lost art. If you think about it, some of the greatest thinkers of our day will credit their success to their curiosity. Look at Voltaire. He said, judge a man by his questions rather than by his answers. Or if you look at Einstein, he said, I have no special talents, I'm only passionately curious. Or George Carlin, who said, why do we sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game when we're already there? The fact of the matter is that some of the greatest thinkers of our day credit their success to curiosity. And if I was to ask each of you, are you known by your clients for your insatiable appetite to gather stories? As I mentioned, Amy mentioned, the book Storyselling has been out now for 17 years. And this work of curiosity was an offshoot of that work talking about stories. Storyselling is nothing more than making the unknown known by using the familiar. And some of the greatest storytellers are not necessarily the most articulate. They're not the Shakespeare's or the Garrison Keillors who just have the perfect analogy and the perfect metaphor and a library of stories they can recall easily. No, the greatest storytellers we found all shared the same common trait, and that was the ability to be curious, and not with some hidden agenda, but just be curious for curiosity's sake. And so that's what you'll gather today, hopefully, as we go through this, because the reality is our clients are a mystery, and what they're showing us is not what's necessarily all there. There's been a statistic that's been bandied about in this industry for more than 2 decades that says the typical advisor only sees about 35% of a client's portfolio. Now, many of you would boast a much higher percentage, and as more and more people become fiduciaries, obviously they're going to have to see 100%. But the reality is we don't ask questions. We just gather a small portion of what the wallet really entails. There's a piece of research we did in addition to this particular project where Russ Prince went out and interviewed 105 blue chip prospects. These are people that had, on average, $3 million of investable assets. And why we did the research is we wanted to find out the commonality between all these people was they all had significant assets, as I mentioned, $3 million, blue chip prospects. But the other interesting trait that they all shared is they all were interviewed because they had met with an advisor, sometimes multiple times, but they all had chosen not to work with their advisor. So they decided to move on. So that's how they qualified for this study. We wanted to find out what were the reasons why that you met sometimes multiple times with a prospective advisor and decided not to choose him or her. Well, there were 8 different reasons that were given, and I'm not going to give you all 8. I want to give you just 2, and I think it's really interesting that these 2, although they don't seem earth-shakingly unique, the relationship between the 2 is really what stood out. So I ask you, what percent do you think of these 105 blue chip prospects said the reason they didn't work with the advisor they interviewed is because they didn't understand the advice? That was a particularly small percentage, only 4%. Well, what percent do you think said, you know what, somewhere in the process, I got the distinct feeling, this is the client talking, that I wasn't understood? See, that was a slightly larger statistic. So here you have it now, almost 90% understood intellectually what the advisor was talking about, whether it was a financial plan or whatever the services that that advisor was talking about. They understood the money management philosophy and the services, but they didn't feel understood. What this tells me is that many advisors, they know all the right things to say, but they don't have a lot of the right questions to ask. And that can be a skill set that everybody on this call can acquire. We can all learn to be better money managers and be more astute in our investment management prowess. But the one thing that can set us apart, what's sorely lacking, is to be a great conversationalist. And that really begins with curiosity. I mentioned how this came out of the book Storyselling. And what we found, as I mentioned before, is that great conversationalists understand the story of the client. And so when they use analogies or metaphors, whatever they're trying to connect, they're able to do it with a deep understanding of who the client is and to understand those desires that the client has. So that's what led us to this work. And as we go forward here, what we'll talk about, as I mentioned before, the power of commonality. 50 years ago, Stanley Milgram did a piece of research that's really interesting. And you might not know the research, but you all know the results of the research because it's a household phrase that we've known for years. He interviewed 97. Keep in mind, this was 60 years ago. In fact, there was a movie made of this in the last couple of years. He interviewed 97 randomly selected Americans, and he challenged them with a simple task. He said, I want to see if you can get a letter to a particular stockbroker in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, he didn't tell them who the stockbroker was. So there's the challenge. You're told you've got to get a letter to a stockbroker you don't know in Boston, Massachusetts. What do you do next? Well, what he found is that these people all began the task by finding the person they thought might randomly have some kind of knowledge of who the stockbroker might be. Now, Columbia University repeated this study in the modern era, and they used the internet and the wonders of email. And this time they had 40,000 participants to replicate this study, same study. And what they found is the same thing Stanley Milgram found 6 decades ago. Guess how many hands those letters went through before they reached that stockbroker? And the answer is 6. It's more than just a Kevin Bacon movie. There are no more than 6 degrees of separation between us and every other human being on the globe. And so when we get curious, the next question is, well, what do we need to be curious about? And what we found in our research is that if you understand these 8 core topics, let's say, for example, you understand the 4 of the 8. What the research that we did with Russ Prince uncovered is that if you understood 4 of those 8 topics, you could get close to 50% of the assets, actually closer to 60%. If you understood and knew 6 of the 8 core topics, you could assume that you could expect to get around 3/4 of the assets. These are obviously high value target clients. What's really interesting is if you learn all 8 of the core topics, not only do you get 100%, you actually get more than 100% because these people are so enamored with your interest in them, they bring referrals. And that's, again, the power of curiosity. It's not a soft skill. It's not something you just get to once you've learned the quote-unquote hard skills of selling. This is everything. We get paid to communicate, and we can truly separate ourselves. Think, as I mentioned before, of great conversations you've had with people who selflessly asked you questions about you. I don't know about you, but this has been a challenge for me because I, like a lot of people, ask questions and then I'm already formulating an answer in my head. Or I ask questions that are not questions at all. They're actually statements that are masquerading as a question. We all remember those growing up when our mother said to us, probably time to clean your room. I mean, that's not a question. That's a statement. It's the same statement we sometimes use as a question when we say, if I could show you a product that would mitigate the downside risk and still give you 75% of the upside market potential, would you be interested in that? Well, that sounds like a question, but it's not. It's a statement. And that statement says, I'm about to show you a product that has downside risk with 3/4 of the upside capture. And so we've got to be careful when we really define what a question is. There's a simple definition. You know you've asked a question if you don't know the answer to that question. And so I think it's very important. So knowing this, what are the 8 core topics? I'm going to give you them in descending order of importance. This is out of, as I said before, a group of 400 investors, out of 151 to be exact, potential topics that you could be curious about. Here are the 8 core topics in descending order of importance that they, your clients, want you to know about them. Number 1, how they made their money. Isn't that interesting that the number 1 topic that they want to talk about with you is how they made whatever money they have, whether they're wildly successful and affluent or believe that that they have significant wealth, although it might not be significant to you. The reality is the reason this is the number 1 topic is, for many people, because they're proud of it. It is their life story. I've talked to so many advisors that deal with retired executives, and one question can get them going, and this is it. How did you make your money? My co-author, Mitch Anthony, likes to say that when you see a client come in, imagine a sign, an imaginary sign, hung around their neck that says the following: make me feel important. For some of these retired executives, they've kind of gone from who's who to who's he. I'll never forget, my oldest son was doing a project back in grammar school where he was interviewing his grandparents about what they were doing. And I remember him getting my dad on the couch in our living room and just asking 1 or 2 questions, and my dad was off and running. And that conversation went on, and Charles had lots and lots of paperwork papers that he filled out on what my dad had done. Why? Because he was proud of it. How they made their money is really important. Question number 2, their best and worst experience with financial advisors. Now, this is curious. This is the number 2 topic they want you to know about it. Why is that? Because the process of engaging with an advisor and the process of disengaging with an advisor is an emotional transaction. And why this is so important is because it's top of mind for them. And they'll tell you what they've liked best about previous relationships they've had with advisors, and maybe even more importantly, what they didn't like. Why is this important for us to have this information? Because we don't want to repeat the mistakes that have been made. And so this is a great opportunity for us to uncover the landmines and gold mines that a client has. And by the way, that's really what our questions are designed to do. I mean, we are asking questions the way, that old detective Columbo used to ask questions. You remember that show Columbo? I date myself, but Columbo was in that ratty raincoat, chain smoking with that pad of paper that was dog-eared, and he'd be walking up the driveway in any given show and knocking on the door and talking to the same person he talked to a week ago, and he seemed to be bumbling and fumbling with his questions and just going nowhere. But you found yourself really clearly realizing that Columbo asked questions with bad intentions. He asked questions that might not have appeared to be great questions, but they were designed to get at the core issues. And that's what questions do. They uncover the landmines or gold mines. I'll never forget, this was years ago. I was traveling from Tampa to West Palm Beach on a little airline that I believe is still in operations called Taka Airlines. I think it stands for Take a Chance Airline. It was a little regional airline, and I remember I was seated in 1B. It was a very small commuter airline, and next to me, I'll never forget her, was this pistol of an older woman. At the time, she was in her late 70s or 80s. This was years ago, And she was a great candidate to talk to about questions and stories. She was a great candidate because of her age and her sharpness, and she was a great candidate because I had her pinned against the seat wall and she couldn't go anywhere. And I'll never forget talking to her about her financial advisor, and I asked her about her financial advisor, and she said, yeah, my advisor has been telling me I should diversify a portion of my assets into the Pacific Rim. And I said, without sort of missing a beat, I jumped to the defense of this unnamed advisor and said, well, that's probably not a bad idea. I mean, he's probably just talking about a small portion of your assets that you could participate in some of these other markets. And she stopped me in mid-sentence. And she turned to me and looked up, and through clenched teeth, she said the following line. She says, I'm not giving one red cent to the enemy. I lost my husband in WW2. Now, you may look at that and say, well, that's ludicrous. But that's a landmine. That's a landmine that some advisor, without being curious, stepped on. And there are gold mines to be found with great questions. I'll never forget an advisor telling me that as he took this skill set to heart and began asking the kinds of open-ended questions he'd never asked before. And I can hear him now telling me, Scott, make sure you tell every advisor to ask this question because it can uncover some of the best gold mines you'll ever find. He asked his client the following question. I would challenge you listening to this today to ask this question of your clients. What's your earliest recollection of the significance of money in your life? Think about that for just a second. I don't have time to give you mine, but I'll remember it. I remember as a 9-year-old, I remember the first time I realized what the value of $1 was. Up to that point, it was just my parents' money, but I understood it for me personally, and that lesson has never left me. I bet you listening to me here have a situation that you can recall when you were little where you understood the value of $1, either the easy way or the hard way. So this advisor asked this question of his client, wasn't sure what the response would be, and the response was stunning. So he asked his client, what's the earliest recollection you have in your life when you understood the significance of money? And this advisor, this client, without missing a beat, said the following. He said, well, that's easy. He said, I remember sitting with my brother. We were on that overstuffed sofa at the curb at the end of our driveway. Why? Oh, because he said my dad was a drinker and couldn't keep a job, and I can remember getting evicted from a couple of places in the span of 3 years. Now ask yourself, do you think that story would be important for you to know as you talk to that client about risk and about the values that he associates with money? One great question can reveal a landmine or a gold mine. And that's really what this question number 2 is all about. Well, how about number 3? This is a really sophisticated question. The actual research question was, who do you love? And here the topic we've got is about whom they care. Who is it that they care about? And this is a reminder to us that we can get caught up oftentimes in the numbers. As I mentioned before, we can look at our clients as a story of numbers, when the reality is there are a number of stories. And if I was a client of yours, a prospective client of yours, what's kind of interesting is if you were trying to woo me into your practice, I can categorize all the questions you ask me into one of 2 buckets. Every question you ask me will fall into one of 2 categories. Category number 1 is, what does Scott West have in terms of his assets? Category number 2 is, who is Scott West? It's kind of like the right brain and the left brain. And our industry has taught us for years to focus on the wrong side of the brain, or at least to definitely lean toward the left side. And so we have all these tools in place to help us try to gather the numbers, fill that one category. And then the reality is, you will probably never attract me as a client if all you know about me is what I have. But you have a great chance of knowing if you truly understand who I am. Now, I'm not suggesting that all you do is ask questions on the right side of the brain about who I am. This is, after all, not a therapy session we're engaging in. We're managing assets. But ask yourself how you're going to dislodge the incumbent as you talk to clients, just by showing a prowess in knowing what their assets are, or in truly balancing it, at least balancing it 50-50 between not just what they have, but who they are. And that's what makes topic number 3 so interesting. It's really understanding that these people love other people. and that they have their greatest motivation being to be engaged with people they love. It's about the people, not necessarily about the plan. Number 4 is a blockbuster of a topic. And if you're listening to me and you thought, well, I need to get challenged to ask better questions, but how do I go back to clients that I've had for a number of years and quite frankly, I don't know the answer to some of these topics, is it too late? This topic here is a great entry point to go back to existing clients where you maybe haven't been as curious as you could be. And what this topic really is understanding that life goes by 100 miles an hour and your life has changed over the last few years, and so has mine. I've got to ask you, is there anything going on in your life that as you think about it is affecting your money that we should talk about? There's a great entry point. That's really taking this topic number 4 and shaping it into the form of a question that you can listen to me today and then hang up and go right back to existing clients and begin that more curious traveling path using that question. Circumstances that impact their financial future. I like to say this, that lives in motion means money in motion. Most of advisors capture their best clients through an event. And the problem is many times they stumble on the event if they even come across it at all. This is a way to become intentional in the way that you ask questions. And so that question, think about your life. Is there anything going on in your life that, as you think about it, has impact on your finances? That's a question that is not invasive. And what our research has shown is of the top 8 topics, this is number 4 that they want you to know about them. On to topic number 5. Who do they rely on for financial advice? This is really important. Many advisors don't ask this question, but this is an opportunity to uncover what? Uncover your competition. And maybe your competition is Susie Orman or Jim Cramer, or a favorite uncle that they rely on for hot stock tips. But this defines for you, as you begin this relationship with a client or deepen one with an existing client, do you know what your competition is, potentially? Both the reasonable parts of the competition, maybe the not so logical. Who do they rely on for financial advice? Topic number 6, how involved they like to be in their financial decision making. Now, what's tremendously powerful about this for us to ask this question of our clients is because it defines not just who our competition is, but now how involved they want to be, what your role is going to be with them, and more importantly, what they want their role to be with you. We've done all kinds of research on sort of 9 different psychographic profiles that clients have, and they run the gamut from being all in VIPs that want to have an ongoing dialogue with you about everything you're doing for them. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have investment phobics. These are people who have no interest whatsoever in talking about money. They'll trust you to manage it, but they don't necessarily want you calling them and talking to them about their investments. So this question is powerful because it shapes the parameters for your relationship with the client. Number 7, what is it they want their money to do for them? In my job, I have the great pleasure of meeting with top advisors every week. And I'll never forget a conversation I had years ago with a 70-year-old advisor in St. Louis, Missouri. This gentleman was near retirement. He was near retirement. In essence, in his last few years, he was selling to his peers. He was selling to 70-year-olds. And he told me, as I watched him for a day and a half, he let me sit in on some of his client meetings. He said, Scott, one of the most powerful questions you can ask a client is, what is it you want your money to do for you? And then number 2, how long would you like that to do it for you? That's a curious question. At the end of the day, people do have a desire for their money to do something. And it may, again, sound irrational or highly emotional, but you want to know at the end of the day what it is that people want to do. And that's what's also interesting about sort of taking some of these questions that we've been given in this industry and giving them a new look. I'm amazed. I took a look at a number of different companies in our industry and what passes for curiosity on some of their questionnaires, their front-end client profiling. And by the way, even that term is an awful term to use. We call the questioning of clients everything from probing to fact-finding to profiling. Nobody wants to be profiled, or for that matter, probed. And one of those questions, I'll never forget it. It's a well-known company that you would know. They're advertising every weekend on all the major golf tournaments, and one of their questions in their front end survey, this is question number 3, was, how long will your retirement last? Now unpack that for just a second. What is that question really asking? It's saying, when are you going to die? Can you think of a more ridiculous way to try to build a relationship with somebody than asking them that particular question? There's other creative, much more open-ended ways to ask it, like this question here. What is it you want your money to do for you? And then topic number 8, how much money they need in order to stop worrying about money. And again, this is interesting because this is a question that always gets answered. Clients will tell you. Now, they may not have a realistic rationale for why they've got that number in their head, but they all have a number. And as I talk to advisors, they find this question particularly helpful because it allows them to then move into investments that will help them achieve that goal, or if the goal is completely unrealistic, scaling back their plan, and it begins a great dialogue. Now, as you look at these 8 topics, the top 8, I ask you this question: how many of those 8 questions have anything to do with a number? And the answer is just one, the last question. 7 of the 8, these are the top 8 topics that clients want you to know about. 7 of the 8, close to 90%, have nothing to do with a quantifiable number. And again, it goes back to really a cross-check for us to think, when I ask questions, how many of those questions are designed to try to uncover a number? Our clients are not a story of numbers. They're a number of stories. So as we look at this, we need to think about our clients as a puzzle. And how do we put into place the puzzle that is our clients' lives? Well, if you've engaged with grandkids or kids in building a jigsaw puzzle, which I'm loath to do, but in addition to the box top, which is obviously my favorite, most important part of the puzzle, the second most important part of the puzzle are the corner pieces. And what I'd like to give you as we move into the third area is what I believe are the 4 corner pieces that make up the puzzle. So let's start with the first corner piece. Where do we start typically relationships with people? And by the way, this is the first of the 4 pieces that make up what I call the natural order of curiosity. I've given you what I believe are the 8 core topics, but if we just take those 8 core topics, write them down, and then machine gun those topics to our clients the next time we meet with them, it doesn't feel natural. It will feel like an interrogation, not a conversation. And so what I'd like to do here is suggest to you that there are really 4 areas that we all touch on as we build significant relationships. And as I go through these 4, think about the best clients you have. And then even broadly than that, more broadly than that, think about those relationships that you hold closest to you. Isn't this the process as we go through this that we have maybe unconsciously gone through as we built a deep and lasting relationship? The first area is history. Why is that the first area? Because as it says here, it's the easiest to answer. When people ask me and say, Scott, where are you from? I say Toronto. It's where I was born. And nobody up to this point has said, no, that's not right. Think again. It's where I was born. I have confidence in that. A number of years ago, I was speaking in Salt Lake City. It was a beautiful winter day, and I'd been enduring a long winter in Chicago, so I took the opportunity because it was sunny and bright and warm. I walked across the street from the hotel I was speaking at, and I took a walk onto the beautiful grounds of the Mormon church there. And I'll tell you something, if you do that, if you walk by yourself on those beautiful grounds, this is not an experience unique to me. It will happen to all of you if you do it, maybe you've done it. You will be joined somewhere in that conversation by a couple of guys, or that stroll rather, you'll be joined by a couple of guys in dark suits that will walk up to you, and in a very non-threatening way, they'll start walking with you, and they're all trained to ask you one question. What is that question they ask? Well, they sometimes ask, how are you doing? But the question that they ask is also one of the most potent questions we can ask of a client. It's by far the most powerful question on the history front. They will walk up to you and say, hey, where are you from? Again, that's a powerful, non-threatening way. And as one advisor told me, if you ask that question of clients and then shut up, He said in 10 minutes, they'll tell you a whole lot more than just their birthplace. You'll uncover the landmines, what they liked about living there, the people that they knew. They'll give you some of the deeply held convictions that they've built based on that history overview. So making sure that you understand history is really important. And a couple of the questions, by the way, we're going to be talking about a potential workshop that's based on this that will allow us to practice these skills. But a couple of the questions that we've picked up from advisors over the years, here's just a couple. We have dozens in each area. What's the best financial decision you've ever made? Or what can you tell me about the financial advisors with whom you have worked? Again, history is the easiest place to start. Now, unfortunately, in our industry, a lot of people will ask some perfunctory questions about history, and then they want to jump from not where are you from, but where are you going? Where are you going next? Let's talk about the future. And I believe that's why a lot of advisors struggle in building deep and lasting relationships, and more importantly, getting the wallet share that they deserve with the time they put in. Because the next corner piece is not about the future. Once we finish by talking about where they're from, the next question is really, where are you now? And we'll call this area transitions. What's changing in your life right now? As I mentioned before, that is the number 4 topic that they want you to know about them, but it's also incredibly important as we build this relationship. And if you think about it naturally, that's what would flow in a conversation that might take place over a couple of hours or a couple of years. Once you understand what someone has done and where they've grown up, where they're from, you would naturally begin asking them, so what's going on in your life right now? Where are you at right now? A couple of questions to sort of flesh out this area are questions like this. When you think about your finances, what are you least happy about? Or who else has a stake in your investment decisions? And these are questions designed to sort of get the state of affairs now with your client's life. What's going on? And remembering the key principle that lives in motion equals money in motion. And this is a non-threatening way to uncover money that might be in motion because of a particular life event. All right, so I found out where you're from with history. I now know where you're going with transitions. Can I now talk about the future? Not yet. There's a third corner piece that we need to put in place. And that corner piece has been very significant for advisors in terms of winning or losing in long-term relationships. And that's the area of principles. Put another way, I now know where you're from. I know now where you are today. Here's what this question asks. How did you get here? What are the principles you hold dear? And as I mentioned before, this is the biggest opportunity to get the principles, deeply held convictions, but also to uncover some of the negative experiences they've had, the biases, the question about their earliest recollection when money was significant. That typically comes up here. Here's a couple of questions that unpack that whole area of principles. Would you invest in something based only on a tip from a friend? I like this second question a lot. This question actually came from an advisor in Colorado, a friend of mine who didn't ask this question and lost a relationship over it. How do you measure the success of your investments? See, he, like many advisors, had thought that the measure of success was something that we all held in common. He was beating the equity benchmark that he had set for himself for success. He was doing well on the fixed income side. So you can imagine his dismay when after a few years, his client leaves him without telling him why, until after. When he went back and in a conversation that happened a couple of years later, if he had asked this question, how do you measure the success of your investments to that client that left, that client would have given him a very short 3-word answer. That's easy. Beat my brother. Beat my brother. I mean, it's ludicrous. It had nothing to do with quantifiable indexes, but that was the qualitative benchmark that this particular client had. So asking questions regarding principles uncovers, as I mentioned before, the landmines and the gold mines. Well, now we can move to that fourth and final area that our industry spends so much time talking about, goals. Where are you from? Where are you now? How'd you get here? And where are you going? Now, the thing I will say here is that we need to be challenge ourselves to be very, take risks on our questions on goals. This is not about asking someone when you're 65 years of age, how much do you really want on a monthly basis after tax? That's not what we're really asking. And that kind of question takes us down a very numeric conversation track. A way to look at that goals question in a different way is to ask a question like this. It's Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock. Close your eyes. You're 70 years of age. What are you doing? Now, that question may sound really different, and that's because it is. But that question is very much like the other question, except you get to the exact same spot, but you have a whole lot more fun doing it. And you get people to talk about the emotions, because behind everyone's investments, as we all know, is a whole series of emotions. If I hear one more person that I hear on speaking dockets and conferences say, we've got to somehow take the emotion out of investing. If we just could eradicate emotion and make people logical and rational, well, the reality is they are always going to attach emotion to investing. Even that word rational is kind of interesting. The root word of that is ratio. And what a rational decision really is a healthy combination of emotion and logic. That's really the key here. And to the extent that we can ask questions, not necessarily just get our clients crying and reaching for their checkbook, but to the extent that we can ask questions that let people express the emotions they have surrounding money, that ratio, that rational decision is a healthy balance between who they are and what they have. And these are the types of questions that get at that. Here's a couple of goal questions as we wrap up here. What is something your parents did for you you'd like to do for your grandchildren? What 3 goals have you yet to accomplish in your lifetime? If you had $1 billion, how much would you leave for your kids? All these questions designed to uncover what their goals are in a way that doesn't simply reduce it to a simple number. So as we kind of wrap up here, what are we talking about? What we're saying here is that there is a natural order to curiosity that begins with history, moves to the present with transitions, make sure we touch on the principles, and then ultimately goes to the goals, but in a creative, open-ended way. What do you get when you do this process? And many of you listening to me are adept at doing this already. What you get is this word here. I can't really define it for you, but you know it when you feel it. When you're talking to a client and you're not sure when you should ask for the close or when you should land the plane, empathy is really what's created when you have great questions. And I found this to be very interesting over the years as I put in practice. Asking great questions is there's almost a biological reaction that occurs. You ask a question that a client is very interested in, or a friend or someone you just meet is interested in giving you the answer to, and they get excited about it, and you in turn get excited about it. There's actually a measurable biological reaction that occurs in this repeated interest and excitement by asking great questions. That's what creates empathy. And that gives you a much more of an astute way to know how to approach a client in the process. So what we've done here is really just added the pieces of the puzzle, I believe, that our clients represent. So as I close, what I'd like to challenge everybody on this call to do is to think about those 8 core topics. Think as you go through the Rolodex in your mind of your best clients. Do you know the 8 answers to those core topics? Do you know how they made their money and what their pride is in doing that? Do you know the competition you face with your clients and how involved they want to be? Do you know all the people that are behind them that they care about? And ultimately, do you know what the number is that they believe they need to have for a successful retirement? As we close here, as I mentioned before, this asking of curiosity is a journey, and it's one that can separate you from the pack. If you take this seriously, you really can become a great conversationalist, because I believe with fanatical curiosity, it pays to ask.
Well, thanks a lot, Scott. And this is amazing insight and definitely worth advisors taking on to their practice. I was just curious if you had some stories about advisors who have utilized some of these strategies that you're mentioning in their practice and how that may have impacted their practice in helping them grow.
Well, not only have we heard stories, but we have a couple of great tools that we put in place. include a deck of cards that we continually add to all the time. I'll get clients that will come up to me, advisors, who will give me great questions they've asked. There's a lot of great stories out there, and I'm sure there's stories from those of you listening to us today of how you have turned a relationship around. Innumerable stories. Our relationships were headed really one way just in terms of numbers, and were completely turned around by asking great questions.
And that deck, as well as Scott's book, will be made available to you by having had downloaded this webcast. Can you just go into a little bit more, Scott, on the workshops that you mentioned? We'll be hosting them together coming up later in the spring. But what can advisors expect to receive during that workshop training?
Well, in many cases, like all skills, there's many listening that are unconsciously competent. You listen to this and say, I'm doing this. But when we get into the 4 core areas and we talk about the natural order of curiosity, it really pays to practice. And so in the workshop, we allow advisors to really scrimmage with the questions. As I mentioned, we have a deck of cards called the Q cards, and they are really designed to help people become more adept. The deck itself will be at the workshop. There's about 30 questions that are all subdivided into each of the 4 areas: history, transition, principles, and goals. And what we find is that advisors will like a couple and not use a couple more. But yeah, I was in an office a couple of years ago in downtown Chicago, and this was an advisor who had been to our workshop, and he had taped up on his screen a couple of our cards in some of the core areas that he really struggled asking, specifically principles. So he had made it a goal to not let the conversation go too quickly without understanding the principles. So he had 2 or 3 of those questions. So in the workshop, we practice those principles in a real live setting. We also do an exercise that's really interesting. We have people engage in a conversation with someone they had no knowledge of before they came to the workshop, and they have 6 minutes to find something they have in common, some place, someone, or something that they have in common. And you will be amazed. I've done this exercise dozens of times across the country with all kinds of skeptical advisors, how powerful the connections are. And within 6 minutes, they've discovered something in common that's significant, a shared hobby or interest, a shared trip they took. And what happens with that exercise is you really learn the power of commonality, and how quickly, this is really important, how quickly commonality leads to trust. When we share something in common with somebody else, unbeknownst to us, trust is established as we look to make connections. And so in the workshop, we teach people to ask great questions just to establish commonality.
Thanks again, Scott. Well, this was fantastic. Like I mentioned, for any of you listening in today, we will be hosting workshops as well as future webinars on sales best practices, as well as just conversation enhancement with your clients. If you have any additional questions, you could email us at info@select-advisors.com or contact us at 949-209-9243. Thanks again, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Have a great day.